Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers, or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honoured to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away, both listening as the stars come out? If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. Picture, if you will, a world stripped of every comfort you take for granted. No warm houses to retreat to when winter's icy grip tightens around the landscape. No grocery stores stocked with endless varieties of food. No hospitals to heal your wounds or medicines to fight off disease. No police to protect you from violence. No laws to ensure justice. This was the reality for our closest evolutionary relatives, the Neanderthals, who roamed Europe and parts of Asia for over 300,000 years before vanishing from the Earth around 40,000 years ago. But their disappearance wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of hundreds of millennia of struggle against a world so hostile, so unforgiving, that every single day was a battle for survival. These weren't the dim-witted cavemen of popular imagination, shambling through prehistory with clubs and grunts. Archaeological evidence reveals that Neanderthals were sophisticated beings with complex social structures, advanced tool-making abilities, and even artistic sensibilities. They buried their dead with flowers, created jewellery from shells and feathers, and may have been the first humans to control fire systematically. Yet for all their intelligence and adaptability, the Neanderthals lived lives of almost unimaginable brutality. Every aspect of their existence was defined by violence, scarcity, and suffering that would break the spirit of any modern human within days. They inhabited a world where a broken bone could mean death, where finding enough food for the day was never guaranteed, where the cold could kill you in your sleep, and where predators, far more powerful than any creature alive today, stalked them relentlessly. To understand just how brutal their lives were, we need to step back in time and imagine ourselves in their world. The Europe of 100,000 years ago bore little resemblance to the continent we know today. Vast ice sheets stretched down from the Arctic, covering much of northern Europe in glaciers thousands of feet thick. The climate swung between periods of extreme cold and brief warmer interludes. But even these warmer periods were harsh by our standards. Temperatures could plummet without warning, and a sudden cold snap could mean the difference between life and death for an entire Neanderthal clan. The landscape itself was a patchwork of tundra, sparse forests and windswept plains. During the worst of the ice ages, much of Europe resembled modern-day Siberia. Imagine trying to survive in such an environment with nothing but stone tools, animal hides for clothing, and whatever shelter you could construct from bones, wood, and rock. There were no metal tools to make work easier, no domesticated animals to help with hunting or transportation, no agriculture to provide a reliable food source. Neanderthals were nomadic hunter-gatherers, constantly on the move in search of food and resources. They lived in small groups, typically consisting of 10 to 30 individuals who were usually related to each other. These groups had to be small enough to sustain themselves on the scarce resources available, but large enough to defend against the numerous threats they faced daily. The social dynamics within these groups were complex and often tense, as competition for resources and mates could quickly turn deadly. The brutality of Neanderthal life began from the moment of birth. Infant mortality rates were staggering, with estimates suggesting that more than half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Childbirth itself was an ordeal that frequently claimed the lives of both mother and child. Without modern medical knowledge or tools, complications during delivery often proved fatal. Even if a child survived birth, they faced a gauntlet of diseases, accidents, and violence that would thin their ranks year after year. Those who did survive childhood entered a world where violence was not just common, but necessary for survival. Neanderthal skeletons show evidence of repeated trauma from hunting accidents, fights with other Neanderthals, and encounters with predators. Broken bones were commonplace, and many individuals show signs of having survived multiple serious injuries throughout their lives. The fact that so many Neanderthals lived with permanent disabilities suggests that their communities cared for their injured members, but it also highlights just how dangerous their daily existence was. The hunt dominated Neanderthal life, and it was perhaps the most dangerous activity they engaged in. These weren't modern hunters with high-powered rifles picking off game from a safe distance. Neanderthals had to get close to their prey, close enough to thrust a spear into a charging mammoth or woolly rhinoceros. They hunted some of the most dangerous animals that ever lived, creatures that could crush a human with a single blow or trample them into the frozen ground. Consider the woolly mammoth, one of the Neanderthals' primary prey animals. These giants stood up to 11 feet tall and weighed as much as 6 tons. Their tusks could grow to over 16 feet in. They were covered in thick, coarse hair that provided protection against both cold and predators. Hunting such a creature with nothing but wooden spears tipped with stone points required incredible courage, skill, and coordination. The hunt was a life-or-death gamble where a single mistake could result in a hunter being gored, trampled, or thrown to their death. But mammoths weren't the only dangerous prey. Neanderthals also hunted cave bears, which were significantly larger than modern grizzly bears and far more aggressive. These massive predators could stand over 10 foot tall on their hind legs and had claws and teeth capable of tearing a human apart in seconds. Woolly rhinoceroses, with their massive horns and unpredictable temperament, were another common target. Even smaller prey animals like reindeer and wild horses could be deadly if they panicked during a hunt, trampling hunters underfoot in their desperation to escape. The weapons available to Neanderthal hunters were primitive by our standards, but represented the pinnacle of Stone Age technology. They crafted spears from straight wooden shafts, carefully shaped and hardened in fire, then tipped with meticulously knapped stone points. These Levallois points, named after the archaeological site where they were first discovered, were works of art in their own right. Creating one required hours of patient work, carefully striking flakes from a stone core to create a sharp, symmetrical point that could penetrate thick hide and bone. But even the finest stone-tipped spear was a poor match for the natural weapons of the creatures they hunted. A mammoth's tusk could shatter a wooden spear shaft like a twig. A cave bear's claws could slice through the thickest hide clothing. The hunters had to rely on teamwork, cunning, and sheer determination to bring down prey that outweighed them by thousands of pounds. The hunting strategies employed by Neanderthals were as brutal as they were effective. They would often drive herds of animals over cliffs, a technique that required precise timing and coordination, but could yield massive amounts of meat if successful. Archaeological sites across Europe show evidence of these cliff drives, with the broken bones of hundreds of animals piled at the base of precipices. But this strategy was incredibly dangerous for the hunters as well. They had to get close enough to the herd to panic them in the right direction, often putting themselves at risk of being caught in the stampede. Another common hunting technique was the ambush, where hunters would hide near water sources or along migration routes, waiting for prey to come within range. This required incredible patience and discipline, as hunters might have to remain motionless for hours or even days, exposed to the elements and vulnerable to predators themselves. The moment of attack was crucial, as the hunters would have only seconds to strike before their prey either fled or turned to fight. When the hunt was successful, the real work began. Processing a mammoth carcass was a monumental task that required the entire group's participation. Every part of the animal had to be used, as waste was a luxury they couldn't afford. The meat had to be butchered and prepared for consumption or preservation, the bones cracked open for marrow, the hide scraped and prepared for clothing or shelter, and the tusks and other valuable materials salvaged for tools and weapons. But success in the hunt was never guaranteed, and failure meant hunger, weakness, and potentially death. Neanderthal groups frequently faced periods of starvation when prey was scarce or when injuries prevented effective hunting. During these times, they were forced to subsist on whatever they could scavenge: roots, berries, insects, and sometimes even the remains of animals killed by other predators. Competition for these meagre resources could lead to violence between groups, as desperate Neanderthals fought over the scraps necessary for survival. The constant threat of starvation shaped every aspect of Neanderthal behaviour. Their bodies evolved to be incredibly robust and muscular, capable of storing fat during times of plenty to survive the inevitable lean periods. Their metabolisms were adapted to extract every possible calorie from their food, and their digestive systems could process foods that would make modern humans violently ill. But even these adaptations weren't always enough to stave off hunger. Archaeological evidence suggests that cannibalism was not uncommon among Neanderthal groups, particularly during times of extreme scarcity. Cut marks on Neanderthal bones found at various sites across Europe indicate that these early humans sometimes turned to consuming their own dead when no other food sources were available. This wasn't the ritualistic cannibalism seen in some human cultures, but rather the desperate act of people facing starvation. The decision to consume human flesh, even that of deceased family members, speaks to the absolute desperation that Neanderthals sometimes faced. The winter months were particularly brutal as the already scarce food sources became even more limited. Plant foods disappeared entirely under blankets of snow and ice, and many animals either migrated to warmer regions or entered hibernation. Neanderthal groups had to rely heavily on stored food during these months, carefully rationing their supplies to last until spring. But storage technology was primitive, and food spoilage was a constant concern. A cache of meat that went bad could doom an entire group to starvation. The cold itself was a relentless enemy that killed as surely as any predator. Hypothermia was a constant threat, and frostbite could claim fingers, toes, or entire limbs. Neanderthals developed sophisticated techniques for creating and maintaining fire, but fuel was often scarce, and a fire that went out during a blizzard could mean death for everyone in the group. They learned to build shelters that could provide some protection from the wind and cold, using mammoth bones as a framework and covering them with hides and packed earth. But these shelters were crude by our standards and offered little comfort during the worst storms. Clothing was another constant challenge. Neanderthals had learned to tan hides and create garments that provided some protection from the elements, but their clothing was heavy, stiff, and often inadequate for the extreme conditions they faced. Creating a single set of winter clothing required the hides of multiple animals, representing weeks or months of successful hunting. A tear in a crucial garment could be life-threatening, and replacing worn-out clothing was a constant struggle. The tools and weapons that Neanderthals relied on for survival required constant maintenance and replacement. Stone tools would break or become dull with use, and finding suitable raw materials wasn't always possible. Knapping stone into useful tools was a skilled craft that required years of practice to master, and not every individual in a group possessed these abilities. A broken spear point or a dull scraper could mean the difference between a successful hunt and disaster. Beyond the constant struggle for food and shelter, Neanderthals faced threats from predators that would terrify any modern human. The Pleistocene landscape was home to creatures that seem almost mythical today. Cave lions, larger than any modern big cat. With males weighing up to 700 pounds and possessing massive fangs designed for crushing bone, these apex predators saw Neanderthals as just another source of prey, and they were perfectly capable of tracking down and killing entire families. Short-faced bears standing over 12 foot tall, when on their hind legs, were perhaps the most terrifying predators Neanderthals encountered. These massive carnivores were built for speed and could run down prey across open ground. Their jaws were powerful enough to crush a human skull with a single bite, and their reach meant that even climbing trees offered no guarantee of safety. Unlike modern bears, which are often omnivorous and relatively predictable, short-faced bears were pure predators with an insatiable appetite for meat. Saber-toothed cats, though smaller than cave lions, were arguably more dangerous due to their specialized killing techniques. Their massive canine teeth were designed to deliver a single devastating bite that would sever major blood vessels or crush the windpipe. These cats were ambush predators, capable of striking without warning and killing their prey before it even realized it was under attack. Hyenas, larger and more aggressive than their modern counterparts, posed a different kind of threat. They often scavenged kills from Neanderthal hunting parties, but they were also capable hunters in their own right. Their powerful jaws could crack open bones to get at the nutritious marrow inside, and they weren't above attacking humans when the opportunity arose. The cackling laughter of hyenas in the night was a sound that struck terror into the hearts of Neanderthal families huddled around their fires. Wolves and wild dogs hunted in packs, using coordinated attacks to bring down prey much larger than themselves. A pack of hungry wolves could easily overwhelm a small group of Neanderthals, particularly if they were weakened by hunger or injury. These predators were intelligent and adaptable, learning to associate human settlements with potential food sources and becoming increasingly bold in their attacks. Even smaller predators posed significant threats. Leopards were capable of climbing trees and could attack sleeping Neanderthals in what they thought were safe locations. Wolverines, though much smaller than the megafauna of the Pleistocene, were incredibly fierce and tenacious, capable of driving much larger predators away from their kills. A wolverine would fight to the death rather than surrender food, and their sharp claws and teeth could inflict serious wounds on anyone foolish enough to challenge them. The constant threat of predation meant that Neanderthals could never truly relax or let their guard down. Someone always had to be watching for danger, even during sleep. Sentinels would take turns staying awake through the night, feeding the fire and listening for sounds that might indicate approaching predators. But exhaustion was also an enemy, and a guard who fell asleep at the wrong moment could doom the entire group. Neanderthal settlements show evidence of defensive measures designed to keep predators at bay. Fires were maintained constantly, not just for warmth and cooking, but as a deterrent to nocturnal hunters. Sharp stakes were sometimes planted around campsites to discourage charging animals. Sleeping areas were often positioned in caves or rock shelters that could be defended more easily than open ground. But none of these measures offered complete protection, and predator attacks were a regular occurrence. The psychological toll of living under constant threat cannot be understated. Modern humans living in war zones or areas with high crime rates experience significant stress-related health problems, and Neanderthals faced threats far more immediate and deadly than anything in the modern world. The constant vigilance required for survival would have been mentally and physically exhausting, contributing to the high mortality rates and short lifespans that characterise Neanderthal existence. Disease was another relentless enemy that Neanderthals had no effective means of combating. Without any understanding of microbiology or medicine, they were helpless against infections, parasites, and epidemic diseases. A simple cut could become infected and lead to blood poisoning and death. Dental problems, which are minor inconveniences in the modern world, could cause excruciating pain and eventually prove fatal if infection spread to other parts of the body. Parasites were a constant companion, both internal and external. Intestinal worms would sap strength and nutrients from their hosts, while fleas, lice and ticks spread diseases and caused constant irritation. Without soap or other cleaning agents, maintaining personal hygiene was difficult, and parasitic infestations were virtually inevitable. Some parasites could cause serious health problems or even death, particularly in individuals who were already weakened by hunger or injury. Respiratory infections were particularly dangerous during the cold months, when Neanderthals were crowded together in poorly ventilated shelters. What we would consider a common cold could quickly develop into pneumonia and prove fatal. The smoke from constantly burning fires would have irritated lungs and airways, making respiratory problems even more likely. Tuberculosis and other chronic lung diseases were probably common, slowly weakening individuals over months or years until they could no longer contribute to the group's survival. Injuries from hunting and daily activities frequently became infected, leading to sepsis and death. A broken bone that didn't heal properly could leave an individual permanently disabled, unable to contribute to hunting or other essential activities. Without antibiotics or surgical techniques, even minor wounds could fester and spread infection throughout the body. The high rates of trauma visible in Neanderthal skeletal remains suggest that serious injuries were a regular occurrence, and many individuals lived with chronic pain and disability as a result. Childbirth was particularly hazardous for Neanderthal women, with maternal mortality rates that would be shocking by modern standards. The large heads of Neanderthal infants, combined with the robust build of adult females, made difficult births common. Without medical intervention, complications during labour often proved fatal for both mother and child. Women who survived multiple births were probably viewed as especially valuable members of their communities, as their experience and fertility were crucial for group survival. The social structure of Neanderthal groups was shaped by the brutal realities of their existence. Leadership likely went to the strongest and most capable individuals, those who could lead successful hunts and defend the group from threats. But this leadership came with enormous responsibility and stress. A leader's decisions could mean the difference between life and death for everyone in the group, and failure was often met with violence or exile. Competition for resources within groups could be intense, particularly during times of scarcity. Archaeological evidence suggests that violence between group members was not uncommon, with Neanderthal remains showing signs of interpersonal trauma. Disputes over food, mates, or leadership could quickly escalate into deadly confrontations. In a world where cooperation was essential for survival, the tension between individual needs and group welfare created constant social stress. The treatment of the elderly and disabled provides insight into both the compassion and pragmatism of Neanderthal society. Some archaeological sites show evidence of individuals who survived serious injuries or illnesses that would have left them unable to contribute to hunting or other essential activities. This suggests that Neanderthal groups sometimes cared for their disabled members, sharing food and providing protection even when those individuals could give nothing in return. However, during times of extreme scarcity, such altruism may not have been sustainable, and difficult decisions about resource allocation would have had to be made. Relationships between different Neanderthal groups were complex and often hostile. Competition for territory and resources could lead to violent conflicts between neighbouring bands. Archaeological evidence suggests that warfare was not uncommon, with sites showing evidence of massacres and defensive fortifications. The discovery of Neanderthal remains with embedded weapon points indicates that these conflicts could be deadly, with entire groups sometimes being wiped out by their neighbours. However, there is also evidence of cooperation and exchange between groups. Similar tool technologies and artistic styles found across wide geographic areas suggest that ideas and techniques were shared between distant communities. This may have occurred through trade, intermarriage, or temporary alliances formed for specific purposes like large hunts or defence against common threats. The arrival of modern humans in Europe around 45,000 years ago added a new dimension to the challenges facing Neanderthal populations. These newcomers brought with them more advanced technologies, including sophisticated projectile weapons, complex tools, and possibly domesticated dogs. They may have been more efficient hunters and better adapted to the changing climate conditions of the late Pleistocene. Competition with modern humans for resources likely intensified the pressures already facing Neanderthal groups. Some evidence suggests that the two species sometimes came into direct conflict, with superior human technology and organisation giving them a decisive advantage. However, there is also evidence of interbreeding between the two species, indicating that relationships weren't always hostile. The gradual replacement of Neanderthals by modern humans wasn't a sudden conquest, but rather a slow process of displacement that took place over thousands of years. As human populations grew and expanded their territories, Neanderthal groups found themselves pushed into increasingly marginal environments where survival was even more difficult. The combination of climate change, competition with humans, and the accumulated stresses of their brutal lifestyle eventually proved too much for the Neanderthal populations to withstand. Even their advanced cognitive abilities and sophisticated culture couldn't save them from the relentless pressures of their environment. Neanderthals created some of the earliest known art, including cave paintings and carved figurines. They developed complex burial rituals and may have had symbolic communication systems. Their tool technology was sophisticated and constantly evolving, showing evidence of innovation and adaptation. But intelligence alone wasn't enough to overcome the fundamental challenges of survival in the Pleistocene world. The extinction of the Neanderthals around 40,000 years ago marked the end of a remarkable evolutionary experiment. For over 300,000 years, these robust humans had survived in some of the harshest environments Earth has ever known. They endured ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and constant threats from predators and disease. They developed technologies and cultural practices that allowed them to thrive in conditions that would quickly kill any modern human. Yet for all their achievements, the Neanderthals ultimately succumbed to the brutal realities of their world. Their story is one of incredible resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity, but also a reminder of how precarious existence can be when survival depends entirely on one's own strength, skill, and cunning. Every day was a struggle against forces that seemed determined to destroy them, and eventually those forces prevailed. The bones and artifacts they left behind tell a story of lives filled with violence, hardship, and suffering that is difficult for us to comprehend. Yet they also reveal a species that was remarkably human in many ways, caring for their injured, creating art, and developing complex social relationships despite the harsh realities of their existence. Their legacy lives on in the small percentage of Neanderthal DNA that most modern humans carry, a genetic reminder of our shared evolutionary heritage and the incredible journey that brought our species to where we are today. As we sit in our comfortable homes surrounded by the conveniences of modern life, it's worth remembering the brutal world that our ancient relatives inhabited. The challenges they faced make our daily problems seem trivial by comparison, yet they persevered for hundreds of thousands of years through determination, innovation, and sheer will to survive. Their story is ultimately one of the triumph of the human spirit over seemingly impossible odds, even if that triumph was temporary, and their line eventually came to an end. The brutal life of the Neanderthals serves as both a humbling reminder of how far we've come, and a sobering glimpse of how quickly our own comfortable existence could be stripped away if the systems and technologies we depend on were to fail. In studying their struggles and achievements, we gain not only insight into our evolutionary past, but also a deeper appreciation for the remarkable journey that led to the world we inhabit today. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials, I'll continue from where part 1 left off, focusing on the brutal realities of Neanderthal life while maintaining the engaging descriptive style established. But if the constant threat of starvation and predation wasn't enough to break the Neanderthal spirit, the very environment they called home seemed determined to finish what hunger had started. Picture, if you will, awakening in a world where winter wasn't just a season, but a merciless executioner that could last for months on end. The Ice Age Europe that Neanderthals inhabited was a landscape that would make our harshest modern winters seem like gentle spring days. When the great glaciers advanced, temperatures plummeted to levels that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The average winter temperature could drop to 40 degrees, with bone-chilling winds that cut through even the thickest animal hides like invisible knives. Imagine trying to maintain a fire when every gust of Arctic wind threatens to extinguish your only source of warmth, when your fingers are so numb from cold that you can barely grasp the tools needed for survival. The Neanderthals faced what scientists call the last glacial maximum, a period when ice sheets stretched across vast portions of Europe like frozen graveyards. These weren't the picturesque snow-covered landscapes we might see in winter postcards. This was a world of grinding, relentless cold that transformed the very air into a weapon. Every breath burned the lungs. Every exposed piece of skin risked frostbite within moments. But perhaps even more terrifying than the cold itself was the psychological warfare it waged on Neanderthal communities. Winter meant confinement in whatever shelter they could construct or find. Imagine being trapped for months in a cramped cave with your entire family group, the walls closing in as supplies dwindled and tempers frayed. The darkness was almost absolute, with daylight lasting only a few precious hours before the sun disappeared behind the horizon, leaving them in a world lit only by the flickering flames of their carefully guarded fires. Sleep became a luxury fraught with danger. Letting a fire die during the night meant waking up to frozen water sources and potentially fatal exposure. Someone always had to remain awake, feeding the flames, watching for the telltale signs that their lifeline to survival was beginning to fade. The constant vigilance, the perpetual fear of cold and darkness, would have taken an enormous toll on their mental state. And when spring finally arrived, it brought its own unique forms of torment. The melting ice created massive floods that could sweep away months of carefully gathered resources in a matter of hours. Rivers became raging torrents that separated families and hunting groups. Sometimes permanently, the ground turned into a treacherous bog of mud and standing water made travel nearly impossible, and created perfect breeding conditions for disease-carrying insects. But the Neanderthals weren't just battling the elements. They were locked in a life-or-death struggle with some of the most formidable predators the world has ever known. The European landscape of their time was populated by creatures that would make a modern lion or bear seem tame by comparison. Cave bears, standing nearly 12 feet tall on their hind legs, claimed the very shelters that Neanderthals desperately needed for protection. These weren't the relatively small black bears we know today, but massive, aggressive beasts with claws like daggers and jaws, powerful enough to crush skulls with a single bite. Picture a Neanderthal family approaching what appears to be a perfect cave shelter as winter approaches, only to discover the telltale signs of cave bear habitation, the massive claw marks scoring the stone walls, the overwhelming must that speaks of a predator powerful enough to kill without hesitation. Do they risk confronting the bear for the shelter they need to survive, or do they continue searching while precious daylight fades and the temperature drops? Even more terrifying were the cave lions, prehistoric cats that dwarfed their modern African cousins. These weren't just larger versions of today's lions, they were apex predators specifically adapted to hunt the large prey of Ice Age Europe, including the Neanderthals themselves. Their hunting strategy was one of patience and stealth, stalking their prey for days before launching attacks that were swift, silent, and almost always fatal. The evidence of these encounters is written in Neanderthal bones found throughout Europe, puncture wounds that match the spacing of cave lion fangs, defensive fractures in forearms raised to ward off attacks, skulls bearing the unmistakable marks of powerful jaws. These weren't isolated incidents, but recurring nightmares that every Neanderthal community faced on a regular basis. Hyena clans presented another constant threat, particularly dangerous because of their pack hunting tactics and their preference for scavenging human settlements. Unlike modern hyenas, these prehistoric giants were bold enough to attack healthy adult humans, especially when food was scarce. They would circle Neanderthal camps at night, their haunting calls echoing through the darkness as they waited for any sign of weakness or opportunity. But perhaps most unnerving of all were the short-faced bears, creatures so massive and aggressive that they dominated every landscape they inhabited. Standing 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing over a ton, these bears were primarily carnivorous and had no fear of humans whatsoever. When a short-faced bear decided it wanted the meat from a Neanderthal hunt, there was no negotiation, no possibility of intimidation or driving it away. The choice was simple: abandon your hard-won food or face almost certain death. The psychological impact of living under constant threat from such predators cannot be overstated. Every shadow could conceal death. Every sound in the night could signal an attack. Neanderthal children grew up knowing that stepping away from the group, even for a moment, could mean becoming prey. The stress of this perpetual vigilance would have aged them rapidly, contributing to their already shortened lifespans. Yet somehow, in the face of these overwhelming challenges, Neanderthal communities not only survived, but developed sophisticated strategies for dealing with mega predators. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated a cave bear's presence, to recognize the territorial markings of cave lions, to predict the hunting patterns of hyena packs. This wasn't just survival, it was a complex understanding of predator behavior that allowed them to coexist with creatures that could kill them effortlessly. Archaeological evidence suggests that Neanderthals sometimes engaged in direct confrontations with these massive predators, not out of bravado but out of desperate necessity. Imagine the courage required to face down a cave bear with nothing but stone-tipped spears and wooden clubs, knowing that failure meant not just your own death, but potentially the death of your entire family group. Yet they did it repeatedly, leaving behind evidence of successful hunts that included some of the most dangerous animals that ever lived. The weapons they developed for these encounters reveal the ingenuity born of desperation. Neanderthal spears weren't the crude pointed sticks often depicted in popular media, but carefully crafted weapons designed for maximum penetration and damage. The wooden shafts were fire-hardened to increase their strength, while the stone points were knapped with a precision that modern flint knappers struggle to replicate. These weren't tools of convenience, but instruments of survival, created by people who understood that their lives depended on the quality of their craftsmanship. But even the most perfectly crafted spear was little comfort when facing a creature that outweighed you by hundreds of pounds and possessed natural weapons far superior to anything human ingenuity could create. The reality was that most encounters with mega predators ended in retreat, abandonment of resources, or death. The few successful confrontations came at enormous cost, with injuries that could maim or kill even if the immediate battle was won. This constant threat from predators shaped every aspect of Neanderthal society. They couldn't afford to send their strongest hunters out alone, yet spreading their defensive capabilities too thin left everyone vulnerable. Children couldn't be allowed to play freely, yet restricting their movement hindered their development of crucial survival skills. Every decision was a calculated risk in a world where the wrong choice meant death, not just for individuals but for entire bloodlines. The stress of this existence is evident in Neanderthal skeletal remains, which show signs of chronic malnutrition, repeated injuries, and premature aging. These weren't the bones of people who lived comfortable lives interrupted by occasional hardship. They were the remains of individuals who fought for survival every single day of their lives, from birth until death claimed them at ages we would consider tragically young. And yet, in the midst of this brutal struggle for existence, Neanderthals somehow found the time and energy to create art, to bury their dead with ceremony, to care for disabled members of their communities. Cave paintings discovered in Spain show that, even while facing extinction, they were driven to leave marks of their passage, to create beauty in a world that offered them little of it. These artistic expressions weren't the leisure activities of a comfortable society, but the desperate assertions of humanity in the face of overwhelming darkness. The care they showed for their disabled and elderly reveals perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Neanderthal society. In a world where every individual had to contribute to survive, they nonetheless supported community members who could no longer hunt or gather effectively. Skeletons have been found of Neanderthals who lived for years with disabilities that would have made them dependent on others for survival. This wasn't just compassion, it was a profound statement about what they valued as a species. One particularly moving example comes from a site in Iraq, where archaeologists discovered the remains of a Neanderthal man who had lived with multiple severe disabilities, including blindness, a withered arm, and extensive injuries that would have left him unable to contribute to hunting or gathering. Yet evidence suggests he lived for years in this condition, cared for by his community. In a world where resources were desperately scarce and survival was never guaranteed, his people chose to share their meagre provisions with someone who could give nothing material in return. This compassion extended to their treatment of the dead, with burial practices that suggest they believed in some form of afterlife, or at least in the importance of honouring those who had passed. They buried their dead with tools, food and personal possessions, indicating a sophisticated understanding of death as a transition rather than simply an ending. Some burials included flowers and other perishable goods, suggesting ceremonies that involved the entire community in saying farewell to the deceased. But perhaps most remarkably, they appear to have grieved. Evidence suggests that some Neanderthal burials were revisited repeatedly, with additional offerings left at grave sites over extended periods. This wasn't just disposal of the dead, but ongoing relationships with those who had passed, a refusal to let death sever the bonds that held their communities together. These glimpses of Neanderthal humanity make their ultimate fate all the more tragic. Here was a species that had survived ice ages, fought off megafauna predators, and maintained their cultural traditions for hundreds of thousands of years. They had developed sophisticated tools, created art, cared for their disabled, and honoured their dead. They had proven their intelligence, their adaptability, and their resilience time and again. Yet, when modern humans began expanding into Europe around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals' long reign was finally coming to an end. The competition for resources in an already harsh environment became even more intense. Modern humans brought new technologies, new hunting strategies, and perhaps most importantly, larger social networks that allowed for more effective cooperation and resource sharing. The final centuries of Neanderthal existence were marked by increasingly desperate circumstances. Their populations became smaller and more isolated, making them vulnerable to inbreeding and genetic bottlenecks. Their traditional hunting grounds were increasingly occupied by the modern human groups, who were often better organised and equipped. The climate was becoming even harsher with the approaching last glacial maximum, making survival more difficult than ever. Archaeological evidence from their final strongholds in Spain and Portugal paints a picture of a people pushed to the very margins of existence. Their tools became less sophisticated, suggesting that the knowledge needed to create their finest implements was being lost as populations dwindled. Their settlements became smaller and more temporary, indicating a people constantly on the move, never able to establish the stable communities that had characterized their earlier existence. Yet even in these final desperate years, they maintained their essential humanity. They continued to bury their dead, continued to care for their disabled, continued to create art when they could find the time and materials. Right up until the end, they remained recognisably the same people who had survived for so long against impossible odds. The last known Neanderthal died alone in a cave in Gibraltar around 28,000 years ago, the final member of a species that had endured for over 400,000 years. With their death, a unique branch of human evolution came to an end, taking with it all the accumulated wisdom, culture, and experience of countless generations who had fought to survive in one of the most challenging environments Earth has ever produced. But their legacy lives on in ways they could never have imagined. Modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA in their genes, a lasting testament to the fact that our species didn't just replace them, but intermingled with them. Their tools and techniques influenced human technology for thousands of years after their extinction. Their art inspired questions about consciousness and creativity that continue to fascinate scientists today. Most importantly, their story serves as a reminder of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. In the face of cold that could kill in minutes, predators that could crush skulls with their jaws, and starvation that was always just one failed hunt away, the Neanderthals not only survived but maintained their humanity. They loved, they grieved, they created, and they cared for one another right up until the very end. Their brutal existence was a testament to what our species can endure when survival is the only option. But their compassion, their art, and their ceremonies remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, humans find ways to assert their dignity and create meaning in their lives. The Neanderthals may be gone, but the strength they showed in the face of impossible odds continues to inspire us today. A reminder that no matter how dark the world becomes, the human spirit can endure. Looking at the summary you've provided and the reference videos, I'll continue the script for part 3 of the brutal life of Neanderthals, with a focus on their social structure, family dynamics, and the harsh realities of survival in their unforgiving world. The harsh realities of Neanderthal existence extended far beyond the physical challenges of finding food and shelter. Their social fabric was woven together by bonds that were both their greatest strength and their most vulnerable weakness. In the flickering light of cave fires, families huddled together against the bitter cold, knowing that survival depended not just on individual strength, but on the delicate threads that held their small communities together. Imagine, if you will, a typical Neanderthal family group, perhaps 15 to 20 individuals bound by blood and necessity, moving across the landscape in an endless search for resources. The elderly matriarch, her weathered hands still skilled at preparing hides despite joints swollen with arthritis. The dominant male, scarred from countless encounters with predators and rival groups, his authority earned through strength and cunning. The mothers, perpetually pregnant or nursing, their bodies worn down by the relentless cycle of reproduction in a world where infant mortality claimed half of all children before their 5th winter. These weren't the noble savages of romantic imagination. These were desperate people living desperate lives where every decision carried the weight of life and death. When food grew scarce, as it so often did, the group faced agonizing choices. The weak might be abandoned to die. The injured, if they couldn't keep pace, might be left behind with nothing more than a few tools and a prayer to whatever gods they imagined watched over them. Yet within this brutality, there existed moments of startling tenderness. Archaeological evidence reveals that Neanderthals cared for their disabled members, sometimes for years. At the Shanidar cave site in Iraq, researchers discovered the remains of a Neanderthal male who had lived for decades despite being blind in one eye, having a withered arm, and walking with a severe limp. Someone had fed him, protected him, valued his presence enough to carry this burden through countless migrations and harsh winters. This duality defined everything about Neanderthal society. They were capable of both extraordinary compassion and brutal pragmatism, often within the same day, sometimes within the same moment. A mother might lovingly tend to her sick child while simultaneously preparing to abandon her aging parent if the group couldn't afford to slow down for weakness. Their communication was likely a mixture of primitive speech, gestures, and grunts. Imagine trying to coordinate a mammoth hunt or negotiate territorial boundaries with such limited linguistic tools. Every misunderstanding could lead to violence. Every failed attempt at diplomacy might mean war with neighbouring groups, and war in the Neanderthal world meant potential extinction for the losers. The children in these groups knew no childhood as we understand it. By age 6 or 7, they were expected to contribute meaningfully to survival. Boys learned to track game and craft weapons, their small hands guided by their fathers as they shaped flint into deadly points. Girls learned the countless skills of gathering, food preparation, and hide-working that kept the group fed and protected from the elements. There was no time for play, no luxury of innocence. Every day was a lesson in survival, every mistake a potential death sentence. Sexual dynamics were likely brutal and pragmatic. In a world where genetic diversity meant survival, women were precious resources to be protected, fought over, and controlled. Rape was probably common, not out of malice necessarily, but as a grim reproductive strategy in a species teetering on the edge of extinction. Pair bonding existed, but it was always secondary to group survival. If taking another man's mate meant better chances for your bloodline, violence was the inevitable result. The stress of this existence left its mark on every aspect of their lives. Neanderthal skeletons show evidence of chronic stress, malnutrition, and repeated injuries. Their teeth were worn down to nubs from using them as tools. Their bones bore the scars of countless fractures, Many healed incorrectly, leaving individuals permanently disabled. The average lifespan was perhaps 30 years, and those who reached old age did so as broken, pain-racked survivors of a lifetime of struggle. Territorial disputes were frequent and vicious. When two groups encountered each other in the wilderness, the outcome was rarely peaceful. With resources so scarce, sharing meant weakness, and weakness meant death. Archaeological sites show evidence of cannibalism, not necessarily ritual, but practical. When your own group was starving, the bodies of defeated enemies represented precious protein that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The psychological toll of this existence is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine living in constant fear, never knowing if today would bring a successful hunt or an empty belly, a safe camp or an attack by rivals. The stress hormones coursing through their systems would have been chronically elevated, leading to shortened lifespans and compromised immune systems. Depression, anxiety, and what we might now recognise as post-traumatic stress disorder were likely endemic. Though they had no concepts or treatments for such conditions, their spiritual life, such as it was, probably centred around appeasing the harsh forces that controlled their fate. The evidence suggests they buried their dead with grave goods, indicating some belief in an afterlife. But this wasn't necessarily a comforting belief. Their gods, if they had them, were likely seen as capricious and cruel, demanding sacrifice and offering little in return. Every ritual, every offering, was probably motivated more by fear than faith. Women faced particular hardships in this brutal world. Pregnancy in the Paleolithic was often a death sentence. Without modern medical knowledge, complications during childbirth claimed countless mothers. Those who survived faced the challenge of nursing infants while maintaining the grueling pace of nomadic life. Menstruation without proper hygiene or protection left women vulnerable to infection and weakness during critical times. The elderly, when they were permitted to survive, served as repositories of knowledge. A grandmother who remembered which plants were edible, which water sources were safe, where the herds might migrate in times of scarcity was worth her weight in survival. But this knowledge came at a cost. To live long enough to become a repository of wisdom meant surviving decades of unimaginable hardship. Watching most of your children die, seeing your body slowly break down under the relentless demands of survival. Their artistic expressions, when they occurred, were likely born from the same desperate need for meaning that drives all human creativity. The cave paintings we've discovered weren't leisurely artistic endeavours. They were urgent communications, attempts to make sense of a world that seemed designed to destroy them. Every handprint on a cave wall was a declaration of existence, a desperate cry that said, "I was here, I survived, I mattered." Tool-making was both an art and a matter of life and death. A poorly crafted spear point might mean a failed hunt and starvation. A dull scraper could leave hides improperly prepared, leading to hypothermia when winter came. The pressure to perfect these skills was immense, and failure often meant not just personal death, but the death of the entire group that depended on your expertise. Fire was perhaps their greatest technology, but it was also a constant source of anxiety. Losing fire meant death, especially in winter. Someone had to tend the flames, constantly feeding them carefully hoarded fuel. The firekeeper held the lives of the entire group in their hands, and the responsibility was crushing. Imagine the terror of waking to find the fire nearly dead, the embers barely glowing with a blizzard raging outside and no dry kindling available. Their relationship with the natural world was one of constant struggle and occasional cooperation. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated changing weather, migrating herds, or approaching predators. But nature was never their friend. It was a harsh master that demanded constant vigilance and offered no mercy for mistakes. Every season brought new challenges, new opportunities for disaster. The genetic bottlenecks that ultimately doomed the Neanderthals were probably invisible to them, but the effects would have been felt in every generation. Birth defects, stillbirths, and genetic disorders would have been more common as their gene pool contracted. The children born with these conditions, in a world without medical care, faced short, painful lives, adding another layer of tragedy to an already brutal existence. Trade and interaction with other groups, when it occurred, was fraught with danger. Meeting strangers could mean access to new resources, new genetic material, new technologies, but it could just as easily mean violence, theft, or disease. The decision to approach or avoid other humans was a constant calculus of risk and reward, with survival hanging in the balance. Their final centuries, as modern humans spread across their territories, must have been particularly devastating. These newcomers brought superior technologies, more sophisticated social organisation, and diseases for which Neanderthals had no immunity. The competition for resources intensified, and the Neanderthals found themselves outcompeted at every turn. They were watching their world end, though they lacked the conceptual framework to understand what was happening to them, even in their last. Strongholds in the remote corners of Europe, where they held on for thousands of years after modern humans arrived, the Neanderthals continued to struggle against the same brutal forces that had always defined their existence. They adapted, they survived, they persevered, but ultimately the mathematics of survival worked against them. Their populations were too small, their resources too limited, their world too harsh. As we consider their final moments, the last Neanderthal breathing their last breath in some forgotten cave, we must remember that this was the end of a lineage that had survived for over 300,000 years. They had endured ice ages, volcanic winters, and countless other catastrophes. They had created art, developed complex tools, and shown remarkable compassion for their fellow beings. They had loved, laughed, grieved, and hoped. Just as we do, their legacy lives on in our DNA, a reminder that we are not so different from these ancient cousins who faced a world far more brutal than anything we can imagine. In their struggles, we see our own capacity for both cruelty and kindness, for both destruction and creation. They were not the primitive brutes of popular imagination, but complex beings trying to make sense of an unforgiving world, just as we are today. The brutal life of the Neanderthals was not just a story of suffering and hardship, it was a testament to the indomitable spirit that drives all human beings to survive, to create meaning, to hope for something better. In their bones and tools, in their art and burial sites, we find the echoes of our own humanity, refined in the crucible of unimaginable adversity. They remind us that survival is not just about strength or intelligence, but about the bonds we forge with each other, and the courage we find to face each new day, no matter how brutal the world may seem. Based on your provided script summary and reference materials, here's part 4 of the brutal life of Neanderthals. Yet even in the darkest moments of their existence, when winter's grip threatened to crush their spirits entirely, the Neanderthals displayed a capacity for compassion that would humble modern observers. Archaeological evidence reveals something extraordinary about these supposedly primitive beings. They cared for their disabled with a tenderness that speaks to the very core of what makes us human. Consider the remains found at Shanada Cave in Iraq, where researchers discovered the skeleton of a Neanderthal man who had lived for decades despite being born with severe disabilities. His right arm had never developed properly, leaving him with a withered limb that would have made hunting impossible. His left eye was blind, and his body bore the scars of countless injuries. By all rights, he should have perished in infancy in a world where only the strong survived. But he didn't perish. He lived. For 40 years, this man was fed, protected, and cherished by his clan. They could have abandoned him when resources grew scarce, when the burden of caring for him became too great. Instead, they chose compassion over convenience, humanity over harsh pragmatism. When he finally died, they buried him with the same reverence they showed their greatest hunters, surrounding his body with wild flowers in what may be humanity's earliest known funeral ceremony. This wasn't an isolated case of Neanderthal kindness. Across Europe, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a people who refused to abandon their weakest members. Elderly individuals with arthritis so severe they could barely walk, children born with genetic disorders, adults who had suffered catastrophic injuries. All were lovingly tended until natural death claimed them. The La Chapelle skeleton tells another remarkable story. This elderly Neanderthal male had lost most of his teeth, making it impossible for him to chew the tough meat that formed the cornerstone of their diet. His jaw had deteriorated, his spine was twisted with age, and walking would have been agony. Yet his bones show clear signs that he lived for years after becoming completely dependent on others. Someone in his group had to pre-chew his food, had to support him when he walked, had to ensure he stayed warm during the brutal winters. In our modern world, where we pride ourselves on compassion and medical care, we struggle to match the selfless devotion these ancient people showed to their most vulnerable members. They had no hospitals, no social services, no government programs to ease the burden of care. They had only their hearts and their hands, and they used both without reservation. But this compassion extended beyond just caring for the living. The Neanderthals developed elaborate burial rituals that reveal a sophisticated understanding of death, and perhaps even an early conception of an afterlife. They didn't simply dispose of their dead like other animals, they honoured them with ceremonies that required tremendous effort and resources. At sites across Europe, archaeologists have found Neanderthal graves that speak to profound grief and enduring love. Bodies were carefully positioned, often in fetal positions as if sleeping. Tools and weapons were placed beside them, suggesting a belief that the dead would need these items in whatever realm awaited them. Some graves contained evidence of ochre, a red pigment that may have been used to paint the deceased, perhaps to restore the appearance of life to their pale, lifeless skin. The burial site at Le Ferrassier in France reveals the heartbreaking story of a Neanderthal family that lost a young child. The small body was interred with extraordinary care, surrounded by carefully arranged stones and buried with a collection of beautiful flint tools. The precision and effort required for this burial could only have come from hearts shattered by loss, from parents who refused to let their child's death pass unmarked. These burial practices weren't simple, pragmatic disposal of corpses. They required planning, coordination, and significant investment of time and energy. In a world where every calorie mattered and every hour could mean the difference between life and death, the Neanderthals chose to spend precious resources honouring their dead. This speaks to a rich emotional and spiritual life that challenges every stereotype about these supposedly brutish creatures. The famous Shanidar flower burial provides perhaps the most poetic glimpse into Neanderthal funeral customs. When archaeologists examined the soil around one skeleton, they discovered clusters of flower pollen from at least 8 different species: hollyhock, bachelor's button, groundsel, grape hyacinth, and others. These weren't random flowers that happened to blow into the cave. They were carefully selected blooms, many with medicinal properties, deliberately placed around the body. Imagine the scene: a grieving family gathering wildflowers from the mountainside, each bloom chosen with care and intention. Perhaps they selected the bachelor's button for its brilliant blue colour, the hollyhock for its towering height and dignity, the grape hyacinth for its sweet fragrance. They arranged these flowers around their loved one's body like a living tapestry, transforming a cold cave into a garden of remembrance. This act of decorating the dead with flowers, something we still do today in our own funeral traditions, reveals a sensitivity and aesthetic sense that shatters every primitive stereotype. These weren't savage brutes mindlessly struggling for survival. They were people who found beauty in flowers, who understood that death deserved dignity, who believed that love could transcend the grave. The emotional capacity required for such rituals suggests that Neanderthals experienced grief much as we do. They felt the crushing weight of loss when a child died, the hollow ache when an elder passed away, the desperate need to honour and remember those who had meant everything to them. Their tears fell on the same earth where they had laughed and loved and hoped. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery came from a cave in Spain, where researchers found evidence of what may be the world's first known case of adoption. A young Neanderthal child, clearly not related to the adults around him based on genetic analysis, had been raised as one of the family. His bones showed the same care and nutrition as the biological children, and when he died, he was buried with identical reverence. In a world where resources were scarce and survival uncertain, this family chose to take in an orphan child who wasn't their own. They fed him when food was precious, protected him when danger threatened, loved him as if he were their flesh and blood. When death claimed him, they mourned him as deeply as any parent mourns a child. This adoption reveals something profound about Neanderthal society. They understood that family wasn't just about blood relations, but about choice and commitment and love. They created bonds that transcended genetics, built communities based on compassion rather than mere survival advantage. Yet even as they showed this remarkable capacity for tenderness, the Neanderthals lived under the constant shadow of violence and loss. Their bones tell stories of lives cut short by predators, by accidents, by the simple cruelty of an indifferent world. Many children never lived to see their first winter. Many adults perished before they could pass on their knowledge and skills to the next generation. The harsh mathematics of survival meant that even the most loving Neanderthal parent had to make impossible choices. When food ran low, who ate first? The strong hunter who could provide for the group, or the elderly grandmother who could no longer contribute? When predators threatened, who was protected and who was left behind. These weren't easy decisions made by heartless creatures, but agonizing choices that tore at the souls of people who loved deeply and grieved profoundly. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Neanderthal groups practiced a form of triage during the harshest times, prioritizing the survival of those most likely to help the group endure. But even these practical decisions seem to have been made with heavy hearts. Bodies of those who died during these dark periods show signs of careful burial when resources allowed, suggesting that even necessary sacrifices were mourned and remembered. The Neanderthal capacity for both violence and tenderness, for both brutal pragmatism and soaring compassion, mirrors our own human complexity. They weren't simple creatures driven only by base instincts, but complex beings wrestling with the same moral dilemmas that challenge us today. In their struggles to balance survival with humanity, we see reflections of our own deepest conflicts. As we examine their legacy, we're forced to confront uncomfortable questions about our own modern world. In our age of abundance and medical miracles, do we show the same unwavering commitment to our vulnerable members that these ancient people displayed? Do we honour our dead with the same reverence? Do we open our hearts to orphaned children with the same generosity? The Neanderthals had every excuse to be selfish, to prioritise survival over compassion. They lived in a world infinitely harsher than ours, where death lurked behind every decision and comfort was an impossible luxury. Yet they chose love. They chose to care for the disabled, to honour the dead, to adopt the orphaned. They chose to be human in the deepest sense of the word. Their story reminds us that humanity isn't defined by our tools or our technologies, but by our willingness to choose compassion when selfishness would be easier, to find beauty when ugliness surrounds us, to love when love seems pointless. In the flickering firelight of their caves, surrounded by dangers we can barely imagine, the Neanderthals discovered truths about human nature that we're still learning today. The Black Death's arrival marked one of the most devastating periods in Neanderthal history, though of course this plague would come much later in human civilization. For our ancient relatives, disease was an even more constant and merciless companion than it would be for medieval populations. Unlike their distant descendants, who had faced the bubonic plague, Neanderthals had no understanding of contagion, no herbal remedies passed down through generations, and certainly no monasteries to provide care for the sick. When illness struck a Neanderthal band, it often meant a death sentence not just for the afflicted, but potentially for the entire group. Respiratory infections were particularly deadly in the cold, damp caves where Neanderthals sought shelter. The close quarters that provided warmth and protection also created perfect conditions for disease to spread rapidly through a family group. A simple cold could escalate into pneumonia, and without any means of treatment, even the strongest hunters could be brought low within days. Parasitic infections plagued Neanderthal communities constantly. Archaeological evidence reveals that these early humans suffered from intestinal worms, skin parasites, and blood-sucking insects that weakened them and made them vulnerable to other illnesses. The very act of butchering animals and handling raw meat exposed them to dangerous pathogens that their immune systems had never encountered. Dental problems were another source of chronic pain and potentially fatal infection. With no means of dental care, broken or abscessed teeth could lead to life-threatening infections that spread to the brain or throughout the body. Many Neanderthal remains show evidence of severe dental disease that would have caused excruciating pain and difficulty eating. Skin infections and wounds that became septic were common killers. A simple cut from a stone tool or animal claw could become infected, leading to gangrene or blood poisoning. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, even minor injuries had the potential to become fatal within a matter of days. The psychological toll of watching family members suffer and die from diseases they couldn't understand or treat must have been overwhelming. Neanderthal groups likely developed their own primitive medical practices, perhaps using certain plants they observed animals eating when sick or applying mud and leaves to wounds. But these remedies were largely ineffective against serious illnesses. Malnutrition weakened Neanderthal immune systems, making them even more susceptible to disease. During harsh winters or periods of scarce game, their bodies became vulnerable to opportunistic infections. Vitamin deficiencies caused by their limited diet led to conditions like scurvy and rickets, further compromising their health. Childbirth was particularly dangerous for Neanderthal women, with no medical assistance available during complications. Many mothers and infants died during or shortly after delivery, devastating losses for small family groups that depended on every member for survival. The high infant mortality rate meant that Neanderthal populations struggled to maintain stable numbers. Tuberculosis likely spread through Neanderthal communities, transmitted through the air in their enclosed cave dwellings. This wasting disease would have slowly consumed its victims, causing them to cough up blood and gradually waste away over months or years. The sight of a family member slowly dying from tuberculosis would have been a source of constant anguish. Zoonotic diseases transmitted from the animals they hunted posed another constant threat. Anthrax from infected carcasses, tularemia from rabbits, and various viral infections from birds could jump to human hosts. Neanderthals had no way of knowing which animals were safe to handle or consume. Food poisoning was a regular occurrence, especially during warmer months when meat spoiled quickly. Without refrigeration or understanding of food safety, Neanderthals often had little choice but to consume partially spoiled meat, leading to severe gastrointestinal illness that could be fatal in their weakened state. The stress of constant survival pressure likely compromised Neanderthal immune systems even further. The chronic stress of finding food, avoiding predators, and protecting their families would have kept their bodies in a perpetual state of fight or flight, making them more vulnerable to illness. When disease did strike a Neanderthal group, it often meant the difference between survival and extinction for the entire band. If the primary hunters became ill, the group could quickly face starvation. If the mothers died, infants had little chance of survival. The interconnected nature of their small family groups meant that illness had cascading effects throughout the community. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Neanderthal groups did attempt to care for their sick and disabled members, indicating a level of compassion and social organisation. However, when faced with limited resources and harsh environmental conditions, difficult decisions had to be made about who could be supported and who might have to be left behind. The constant threat of disease shaped every aspect of Neanderthal behaviour. And social structure. They lived with the knowledge that any day could bring illness that would end their lives or destroy their families. This uncertainty added another layer of stress to an already brutal existence. As we consider the medical challenges faced by Neanderthals, we can better appreciate both their resilience and the tragic circumstances that ultimately led to their extinction. Disease was not just an occasional threat, but a constant shadow that followed them through their brief, harsh lives in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or unlucky. Looking at the reference materials and your previous script content, here's part 6 of the brutal life of Neanderthals. Beyond the immediate threats of predators and violence, Neanderthals faced an even more insidious enemy that stalked them through every season: disease. In a world without medicine, antibiotics, or even basic understanding of hygiene, illness was a death sentence waiting to strike. The cramped living conditions of Neanderthal caves created perfect breeding grounds for pathogens to spread like wildfire through family groups. Imagine huddling together in a dank cave for warmth during the bitter winter months, sharing the same contaminated air with sick family members. Respiratory infections would tear through these small communities with devastating efficiency. A simple cold could escalate into pneumonia, claiming the lives of the young, old and weak within days. The same caves that provided shelter from predators became death traps when disease took hold. Archaeological evidence reveals the grim reality of Neanderthal health. Skeletal remains show signs of chronic infections, broken bones that healed poorly, and dental abscesses that would have caused excruciating pain. Without proper medical knowledge, even minor injuries could fester into life-threatening infections. A small cut from a stone tool or animal bite could lead to sepsis and death. The harsh environment constantly battered their immune systems. Malnutrition weakened their body's natural defences, making them vulnerable to every pathogen they encountered. During lean times when game was scarce, their weakened state left them defenceless against the microscopic killers that thrived in their unsanitary living conditions. Parasites were another relentless torment. Intestinal worms transmitted through contaminated water and food would slowly sap their strength and nutrition. These internal invaders caused chronic diarrhea, abdominal pain and gradual wasting away. Children were particularly vulnerable, with many likely dying from severe parasite loads before reaching adulthood. The lack of medical knowledge meant that even treatable conditions became death sentences. Appendicitis, kidney stones, or complications during childbirth claimed countless lives. Mothers frequently died in labour, leaving newborns to face an uncertain fate without maternal care. The infant mortality rate was staggering, with estimates suggesting that up to 50% of Neanderthal children never reached their 5th birthday. Seasonal outbreaks of disease could devastate entire populations. When pathogens spread through the small interconnected groups that made up Neanderthal society, there was nowhere to run and no way to treat the sick. Entire family lineages could be wiped out in a matter of weeks, leaving behind only scattered bones as evidence of their existence. The constant threat of illness shaped every aspect of Neanderthal life. The fear of sickness added another layer of stress to their already precarious existence. They lived knowing that any day could bring the onset of a mysterious illness that would slowly drain their life away. This psychological burden, combined with the physical toll of their harsh lifestyle, created a perfect storm of suffering. Joint problems plagued older Neanderthals, with arthritis setting in early due to their physically demanding lifestyle. The constant strain of hunting, gathering and crafting tools took a severe toll on their bodies. By middle age, many would have been crippled by joint pain and mobility issues, making them burdens on their already struggling communities. Dental problems were endemic, with tooth decay and abscesses causing constant agony. Without any form of dental care, infected teeth would rot in their mouths, causing facial swelling and potentially fatal infections. The pain would have been unbearable, making it difficult to eat the tough, coarse foods that made up their diet. Skin conditions and infections were constant companions in their filthy living environment. Open wounds from hunting accidents or fights with predators had little chance to heal properly in the bacterial-laden caves. Festering sores and chronic skin infections added to their daily misery, attracting flies and further increasing the risk of disease transmission. The psychological impact of living under the constant threat of illness cannot be understated. Watching family members waste away from mysterious diseases, seeing children die from conditions that seemed to come from nowhere, and knowing that their own bodies were failing them day by day created a pervasive atmosphere of dread and hopelessness. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming medical challenges, some Neanderthals showed remarkable resilience. Archaeological evidence reveals individuals who survived serious injuries and lived for years afterward, suggesting that their communities sometimes provided care for the sick and disabled. This compassion in the face of such harsh conditions speaks to the depth of their humanity. The story of Neanderthal health is ultimately one of courage in the face of impossible odds. They lived every day knowing that disease could strike without warning, yet they continued to love, care for their families, and build their simple societies. Their struggle against illness and injury was just another chapter in the brutal story of their existence, a testament to the incredible hardships our ancient relatives endured in their fight for survival. The medieval period was a time of extraordinary brutality, where survival itself was a daily battle against forces both human and natural. As we've seen through our exploration of clan feuds, peasant struggles, and the devastating impact of the Black Death, life for ordinary people was marked by constant uncertainty and hardship. Yet within this darkness, we find remarkable examples of human resilience and ingenuity, the rise of urban centres and new challenges. As we continue our journey through medieval Scotland, we must turn our attention to the emerging urban centres that began to dot the landscape. While the majority of Scots still toiled in rural fields, a growing number found themselves drawn to the burghs, fortified towns that offered new opportunities and new dangers in equal measure. These early Scottish towns were a far cry from the romantic cobblestone streets we might imagine today. Picture, if you will, the Burgh of Edinburgh in the late 13th century. Narrow, winding streets barely wide enough for a cart wound their way up the steep incline toward the imposing castle that crowned the rocky outcrop. The air was thick with smoke from countless hearth fires, the acrid smell of tanning hides, and the less pleasant odour of human and animal waste that collected in the gutters. The buildings themselves seemed to lean inward, their upper stories jutting out over the streets below, creating a perpetual twilight at ground level. Timber-framed structures, their gaps filled with wattle and daub, crowded together so closely that a fire in one building could quickly spread to consume entire neighbourhoods. And fires were common, whether started by an overturned candle, a spark from a forge, or the deliberate act of raiders seeking to terrorise the population. The merchant class, a new kind of struggle. Within these urban centres, a new class of people emerged. The merchants and craftsmen who formed the backbone of Scotland's growing economy. These were men and women who had escaped the direct bondage of serfdom, but they faced challenges no less daunting than their rural counterparts. Consider the story of Robert the Merchant, a wool trader who had managed to establish himself in the Burg of Stirling. Robert had been born a peasant, the son of a man who spent his days behind a plough. But through a combination of cunning hard work and no small amount of luck, he had managed to accumulate enough silver to purchase his freedom and establish a small trading business. Robert's days began before dawn as he made his way through the muddy streets to inspect the latest shipments of wool from the surrounding countryside. The quality varied enormously. Some fleeces were thick and lustrous, perfect for the fine cloth that would fetch high prices in the markets of Flanders. Others were coarse and dirty, suitable only for the roughest garments worn by labourers and peasants. The work was not without its perils. Bandits haunted the roads between towns, always ready to relieve an unwary merchant of his goods and his life. Robert had learned to travel in groups when possible, and to carry a sword that he knew how to use. He had seen too many fellow traders who had set out with high hopes only to be found days later, stripped naked and left for the crows. But the dangers were not limited to highway robbery. The very nature of medieval commerce was fraught with uncertainty. A ship carrying precious cargo might be lost in a storm. A warehouse full of goods might burn to the ground. A lord might decide to impose new taxes, or simply confiscate a merchant's entire stock on some trumped-up charge. Robert had experienced all of these misfortunes over the years. He had watched his carefully accumulated wealth vanish overnight, forcing him to start again from nothing. The stress of it all had aged him prematurely. His hair had turned grey before his 40th birthday, and deep lines were etched around his eyes from years of squinting at ledgers by candlelight. The guild system, protection and oppression. To protect themselves from some of these uncertainties, merchants and craftsmen banded together to form guilds, associations that controlled who could practice a particular trade and under what conditions. The guild system offered certain protections, but it also created new forms of oppression. Take the example of William the blacksmith, who had trained for 7 long years as an apprentice before becoming a journeyman. William's master had been a harsh taskmaster, working his apprentices from dawn to dusk and providing them with little more than a straw pallet to sleep on and thin gruel to eat. Many apprentices didn't survive the rigorous training. Some were maimed by the dangerous work, others simply wasted away from malnutrition and exhaustion. But William had persevered, and eventually he had learned the secrets of working iron and steel. He could forge everything from horseshoes to sword blades, and his reputation for quality work had spread throughout the burg. Yet even as a master craftsman, William found himself constrained by the guild's regulations. The guild dictated how much he could charge for his work, what materials he could use, and even how many apprentices he could take on. Any deviation from these rules could result in heavy fines or expulsion from the guild, effectively ending his career. The guild also demanded regular payments and contributions, adding to the already heavy burden of taxes imposed by the local lord and the church. Moreover, the guild system created fierce competition between different trades. The blacksmiths were constantly at odds with the armourers over who had the right to make certain types of metalwork. The bakers fought with the brewers over access to grain supplies. These disputes sometimes erupted into violent confrontations that could paralyse entire neighbourhoods. Urban diseases, new forms of suffering. The concentration of people in medieval towns created ideal conditions for the spread of disease. While rural peasants faced their own health challenges, urban dwellers confronted new and terrifying forms of pestilence. The narrow streets and crowded buildings of medieval burgs were breeding grounds for vermin. Rats scurried through the garbage that accumulated in every corner, while fleas and lice infested the clothing and bedding of rich and poor alike. The lack of proper sanitation meant that human waste often contaminated water supplies, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and cholera. But it was the arrival of the Black Death in the 14th century that truly revealed the vulnerability of urban populations. The plague spread with horrifying speed through Scotland's towns, killing rich and poor with equal ferocity. In some, half the population perished within a matter of months. The social fabric of these communities unravelled in the face of such catastrophe. Families abandoned their sick relatives, priests fled their parishes, and merchants closed their shops and barricaded themselves in their homes. The dead piled up in the streets faster than they could be buried, and the stench of decay hung over the towns like a suffocating blanket. Women in medieval urban life. For women, Life in medieval Scottish towns presented both opportunities and dangers that were largely absent in rural areas. While peasant women were certainly oppressed, their roles were at least clearly defined by centuries of tradition. Urban women, by contrast, found themselves navigating a more complex and often hostile environment. Some women managed to establish themselves as successful traders or craftswomen. There were female brewers known as alewives who supplied much of the beer consumed in medieval towns. Some women worked as seamstresses, creating the fine clothing worn by wealthy merchants and their families. Others operated taverns or boarding houses, providing food and lodging to travellers. But success came at a price. Women in business were subject to constant suspicion and harassment. They were accused of using witchcraft to attract customers, of adulterating their products, or of engaging in prostitution. The slightest misstep could result in public humiliation, heavy fines, or worse. Take the case of Margaret the alewife, who had built up a thriving brewery in the burgh of Perth. Margaret had inherited the business from her late husband, and through hard work and shrewd dealing she had expanded it considerably. Her ale was known throughout the region for its quality and strength. But Margaret's success attracted the wrong kind of attention. Rival brewers spread rumours that she was diluting her ale with water from the town's polluted wells. Religious authorities suggested that her remarkable success could only be explained by dealings with the devil. And when several customers fell ill after drinking her ale, probably from causes completely unrelated to the brewing process, Margaret found herself accused of poisoning. The trial was a mockery of justice. Margaret was subjected to the ordeal by water, thrown into the river to see if she would float, which would prove her guilt as a witch. When she nearly drowned and had to be pulled from the water, this was taken as evidence of her innocence on the witchcraft charge. But the damage to her reputation was irreversible. Her customers abandoned her, her business collapsed, and she died in poverty a few years later. The constant threat of violence. Violence was an ever-present reality in medieval Scottish towns, just as it was in the countryside. The concentration of people, wealth, and competing interests created numerous opportunities for conflict. Street fights were common, often erupting over the business disputes, personal insults, or simple drunkenness. The narrow streets and lack of effective law enforcement meant that these confrontations could quickly escalate into serious riots. Weapons were readily available. Every man carried at least a knife, and many had swords or other implements of war. The night brought particular dangers. Most towns had curfews that required citizens to remain indoors after dark, but these were often ignored or poorly enforced. Thieves and cutthroats prowled the unlit streets, preying on anyone foolish enough to venture out alone. The bodies of murder victims were regularly discovered in alleys and side streets, their purses cut away and their throats slit. Even the authorities themselves were often corrupt and violent. Town guards supplemented their meagre wages by taking bribes from criminals or by engaging in theft and extortion themselves. Judges could be bought, and justice was more often determined by the size of one's purse than by the facts of the case, religious tensions in urban centres. The concentration of wealth and power in medieval towns also made them focal points for religious and political conflicts. The church maintained a strong presence in most burghs, with cathedrals, monasteries, and parish churches competing for influence and resources. But the urban environment also fostered new forms of religious expression that sometimes put townspeople at odds with orthodox authorities. Heretical movements found fertile ground among merchants and craftsmen who had gained literacy and exposure to new ideas through trade. The Lards, followers of the English reformer John Wycliffe, gained a foothold in several Scottish towns during the 14th and 15th centuries. These religious dissidents challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, arguing that individuals could have a direct relationship with God without the mediation of priests. Such ideas were dangerous in an age when religious conformity was seen as essential to social order. Those suspected of heresy faced investigation by church authorities, torture to extract confessions, and execution by burning if they refused to recant their beliefs. The story of James Resby illustrates the fate that awaited religious dissidents. Resby was an English lard who arrived in Scotland around 1407, preaching Wycliffe's doctrines in the burghs of Edinburgh and St Andrews. He attracted a following among educated townspeople who were drawn to his message of religious reform. But Resby's activities soon came to the attention of the authorities. He was arrested, tried for heresy, and condemned to death. In 1407, he was burned at the stake in Perth, becoming one of the first Protestant martyrs in Scottish history, His execution sent a clear message to others who might be tempted to challenge religious orthodoxy. The economics of survival. For most urban dwellers, daily life was a constant struggle to earn enough to survive. Unlike rural peasants, who at least had access to small plots of land where they could grow food, townspeople were entirely dependent on the cash economy. This dependence made them vulnerable to economic fluctuations that were beyond their control. A poor harvest could drive up food prices, leaving urban workers unable to afford basic necessities. Political conflicts could disrupt trade routes, throwing merchants and craftsmen out of work. Currency debasements by royal governments could wipe out savings overnight. The story of Thomas the Weaver illustrates the precarious nature of urban economic life. Thomas had spent years perfecting his craft, creating fine woolen cloth that was in high demand among the wealthy. He had managed to save enough money to purchase his own loom and set up a small workshop in the Burgh of Aberdeen. For a few years, Thomas prospered. His cloth was renowned for its quality, and he had more orders than he could fulfill. He was able to take on apprentices, expand his workshop, and even purchase a small house for his family. But then disaster struck. A war between Scotland and England disrupted the wool trade, cutting off Thomas's supply of raw materials. At the same time, competition from Flemish weavers drove down the price of finished cloth. Thomas found himself caught between rising costs and falling revenues. Within a year, Thomas had lost everything. He was forced to sell his loom, dismiss his apprentices, and move his family into a single room above a tavern. He spent his remaining years working as a day labourer, hauling cargo at the docks and doing whatever odd jobs he could find. The skills that had once made him prosperous were now worthless in an economy that had no place for his craft. Children in medieval towns. For children, medieval towns were particularly harsh environments. While rural children faced many dangers, they at least had access to open spaces and could contribute to their family's survival through simple agricultural tasks. Urban children, by contrast, were trapped in crowded, polluted environments with few opportunities for productive work. Child mortality rates in medieval towns were staggering. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and the rapid spread of infectious diseases meant that perhaps half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Those who survived often bore the physical and psychological scars of their harsh upbringing. Children as young as 7 or 8 were put to work in whatever capacity they could manage. They swept streets, carried messages, helped in workshops, and begged for alms. The work was often dangerous. Children working near forges could be burned by the hot metal. Those helping with construction could be crushed by falling stones. And those working on the docks could drown in the murky waters of harbours. Education was available only to the children of the wealthy, and even then, it was limited. Most urban children grew up illiterate, unable to read or write even their own names. This lack of education trapped them in cycles of poverty, as they were unable to advance beyond the most menial forms of labour. The story of young Mary, an orphan girl in medieval Glasgow, illustrates the plight of urban children. Mary's parents had died in a plague outbreak when she was 6 years old, leaving her to fend for herself on the streets. She survived by begging, stealing, and doing whatever small job she could find. Mary slept in doorways and abandoned buildings, constantly cold and hungry. She learned to be wary of adults, as many would take advantage of a vulnerable child. She was beaten by shopkeepers who caught her stealing bread, chased by dogs and preyed upon by men who sought to exploit her desperation. Despite all of this, Mary managed to survive to adulthood. She eventually found work as a servant in a merchant's household, where she at least had regular meals and a roof over her head. But the years of hardship had taken their toll. She was small and sickly, aged beyond her years by the struggle for survival. The emergence of banking and credit. As medieval Scottish towns grew in size and economic importance, new financial institutions began to emerge. The constant need for credit to finance trade and craft production led to the development of primitive banking systems. Italian merchants, with their sophisticated understanding of finance, played a crucial role in this development. They established branches of their banking houses in major Scottish burghs, providing loans to local merchants and facilitating international trade. But for ordinary townspeople, access to credit was limited and expensive. Most had to rely on local moneylenders, who charged exorbitant interest rates and used brutal methods to collect debts. Those who fell behind on their payments could find themselves stripped of all their possessions and thrown into debtor's prison. The church officially condemned usury, the charging of interest on loans, as a sin against God. But this prohibition was widely ignored, and even church institutions often engaged in money-lending activities disguised as other transactions. The development of credit relationships also created new forms of social tension. Debtors and creditors were locked in relationships of mutual dependence and suspicion. A merchant who extended too much credit might find himself bankrupt if his customers couldn't pay. A craftsman who borrowed money to expand his business might find himself enslaved to his creditors if the venture failed. Seasonal rhythms and urban life. Despite their separation from agricultural life, medieval towns were still governed by seasonal rhythms that affected every aspect of daily existence. Winter brought particular hardships as food became scarce and expensive, while the cold and damp exacerbated health problems. The approach of winter sent townspeople into a frenzy of preparation. Merchants stockpiled goods that might become unavailable during the harsh months ahead. Craftsmen worked longer hours to complete orders before the short days and cold weather made work more difficult. Families gathered whatever fuel they could afford, wood, peat or coal, to keep their homes warm. But despite these preparations, winter was always a time of suffering for the urban poor. Those without steady employment found it almost impossible to earn money during the coldest months. Food prices soared as supplies dwindled, and many families were forced to choose between heating their homes and feeding their children. Spring brought relief, but also new challenges. The melting snow and increased rainfall often caused flooding in low-lying areas of towns. The streets, already muddy and foul, became virtually impossible. Disease outbreaks were common as contaminated water spread through urban populations. Summer offered the best opportunities for economic activity, but it also brought its own dangers. The heat could make working conditions in workshops and forges almost unbearable. Food spoiled quickly without refrigeration, leading to frequent cases of food poisoning. And the dry conditions increased the risk of fires, which could devastate entire neighbourhoods in a matter of hours. Autumn was a time of both harvest and anxiety. While the surrounding countryside might produce abundant crops, townspeople had to compete with rural populations for access to food. Merchants who had gambled on grain futures might find themselves either wealthy or ruined, depending on the success of the harvest. The role of taverns and alehouses. In the harsh world of medieval Scottish towns, taverns and alehouses served as crucial social institutions. They provided not just food and drink, but also warmth, companionship, and a temporary escape from the grinding realities of daily life. These establishments were often run by women, the alewives, who brewed the beer that was the primary beverage for most townspeople. Water was often unsafe to drink, so weak ale served as a substitute that provided both hydration and calories. But taverns were also centres of vice and violence. Gambling was common, leading to fights when disputes arose over debts or accusations of cheating. Prostitutes plied their trade in many alehouses, adding another layer of social complexity, and the consumption of alcohol often led to brawls that could spill out into the streets. The authorities viewed taverns with deep suspicion. They were seen as breeding grounds for sedition, where discontented craftsmen and labourers might gather to plot against their betters. Regular raids by town guards were common, and tavern keepers had to maintain a delicate balance between serving their customers and avoiding trouble with the law. Medical care in medieval towns. While medieval towns offered some advantages over rural areas in terms of access to medical care, the reality was that most urban dwellers received little effective treatment when they fell ill. The few trained physicians who practiced in Scottish burghs catered primarily to wealthy merchants and nobles. For ordinary townspeople, medical care was provided by a motley collection of barber surgeons, wise women, and quacks. Barber surgeons could perform basic procedures like tooth extraction and bloodletting, but their understanding of anatomy and disease was primitive. Wise women relied on herbal remedies and folk knowledge passed down through generations, and quacks simply preyed on the desperate selling worthless potions and promising miraculous cures. The concentration of people in towns also meant that epidemics could spread with terrifying speed. The Black Death was just the most famous of many disease outbreaks that periodically devastated urban populations. Smallpox, typhus, and influenza were regular visitors to medieval towns, each leaving trails of death and suffering in their wake. Hospitals, when they existed at all, were primarily religious institutions focused more on spiritual than physical healing. Patients were expected to pray for recovery, while enduring treatments that were often more harmful than helpful. The concept of hygiene was poorly understood, and hospitals could be as dangerous as the diseases they purported to treat. Crime and punishment in urban centres. The concentration of wealth and people in medieval towns inevitably led to high levels of criminal activity. Theft was the most common crime, ranging from petty pickpocketing to major burglaries of merchant warehouses. The punishment for theft was severe and often brutal. Minor offences might result in public humiliation. Thieves could be locked in stocks or pillories where townspeople were encouraged to pelt them with rotten food or worse. More serious crimes could result in mutilation, the loss of a hand or ear, or even execution. Murder was surprisingly common in medieval towns, often arising from business disputes, personal grudges, or simple drunken brawls. The lack of effective police forces meant that justice was often a matter of private vengeance rather than legal process. Courts existed, but they were often corrupt and inefficient. Judges could be bribed, witnesses intimidated, and evidence fabricated. Those with money and connections could often escape punishment for even serious crimes, while the poor faced harsh sentences for minor offences. The concept of rehabilitation was virtually unknown. Punishment was seen as a form of deterrence and revenge rather than an opportunity for reform. This approach did little to reduce crime rates and may have actually encouraged more violent and desperate criminal behaviour. The struggle for political representation. As medieval Scottish towns grew in economic importance, their residents began to demand greater political representation. Merchants and craftsmen chafed under the rule of feudal lords, who understood little about urban life and cared less about the needs of townspeople. The development of burgh councils marked the beginning of urban self-government in Scotland. These bodies, composed primarily of wealthy merchants, were granted limited authority to regulate trade, maintain order, and collect taxes within their jurisdictions. But political power remained concentrated in the hands of a small elite. The vast majority of townspeople, labourers, servants, and small craftsmen had no voice in government. This lack of representation led to periodic uprisings and riots as the urban masses sought to assert their rights against their social superiors. The story of the crafts uprising in Edinburgh in 1513 illustrates these tensions. The city's craftsmen, led by the deacons of various guilds, demanded greater representation on the town council and a voice in municipal affairs. When their demands were rejected, they took to the streets in violent protest. The uprising was brutally suppressed by forces loyal to the burgh's merchant elite. Several craftsmen were executed. Many more were imprisoned or exiled, and the guilds were stripped of much of their political influence. The message was clear: political power would remain in the hands of those who already possessed economic power. Cultural life in medieval towns. Despite the hardships and dangers of urban life, medieval Scottish towns also became centres of cultural development. The concentration of wealth and literacy created audiences for new forms of artistic expression. Travelling minstrels and storytellers found ready audiences in urban taverns and market squares. These performers brought news from distant places, entertainment for the weary, and a connection to the broader world beyond the town walls. Religious festivals provided opportunities for elaborate pageants and performances. Mystery plays depicting biblical stories were performed in town squares on holy days. These productions involved entire communities and provided both entertainment and religious instruction for largely illiterate populations. The development of guild systems also fostered certain forms of artistic achievement. Craftsmen took pride in their work, creating objects of both utility and beauty. Goldsmiths, stone carvers, and textile workers produced works of art that rivaled anything created in larger European centres. Conclusion: the urban experience, life in medieval Scottish towns, was marked by the same brutality and hardship that characterised rural existence, but it took on new and distinctive forms. The concentration of people, wealth, and power created opportunities for advancement that were largely absent in the countryside. But it also generated new forms of conflict and suffering. Urban dwellers faced unique challenges: the constant threat of fire and disease, the volatility of market economies, the corruption of legal and political systems, and the social tensions generated by extreme inequality. Yet they also participated in the creation of new forms of community, culture, and economic organisation that would eventually transform Scottish society. The medieval burgh represented both the promise and the peril of human civilization. It showed what people could accomplish when they worked together. But it also revealed the depths of cruelty and exploitation that marked human relationships in an age without effective institutions of justice or social welfare. As we reflect on these urban experiences, we see once again the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. The merchants who rebuilt their businesses after devastating losses, the craftsmen who maintained their pride and skill despite economic uncertainty, the women who carved out spaces for themselves in hostile environments, and the children who somehow survived to adulthood despite overwhelming odds. All of these represent the indomitable human spirit that enabled medieval civilization to persist and eventually flourish. The brutal life of medieval Scots, whether in countryside or town, was indeed brutal. But it was also marked by moments of creativity, compassion, and courage that remind us of the fundamental dignity of human existence, even in the darkest of times. These stories from Scotland's urban centres add another layer to our understanding of how our ancestors lived, struggled, and ultimately triumphed over the forces that sought to crush their spirits. In our modern world, as we face our own challenges and uncertainties, we might draw inspiration from these long-ago urbanites who built communities of mutual support in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Their legacy lives on not just in the physical structures they created, but in the institutions, traditions, and values that continue to shape Scottish society today. The Brutal Life of Neanderthals, Part 8. The endless struggle for survival in the Neanderthal world wasn't just about finding food or avoiding predators. Perhaps the most devastating force they faced was one they could neither see nor comprehend: disease. In a world without medicine, without understanding of hygiene, without even the concept of contagion, illness struck like lightning from a clear sky, claiming lives with ruthless efficiency. Picture a Neanderthal band huddled around their fire as winter's grip tightened across the landscape. The eldest member of the group, a weathered woman whose hands bore the scars of countless hunts and gatherings, begins to cough. At first, it seems like nothing, perhaps smoke from the fire or the cold air catching in her throat. But as the days pass, the cough deepens, becomes wet and violent. Her breathing grows laboured, her skin burns with fever, and soon others in the group begin showing the same symptoms. This was the terrifying reality of respiratory infections in the Neanderthal world. What we now know as pneumonia, tuberculosis, or even the common cold could devastate an entire group. Their close-knit living arrangements, while providing warmth and protection, became death traps when infectious diseases took hold. Families who had survived mammoth hunts and cave bear attacks found themselves powerless against microscopic enemies they couldn't even imagine. The archaeological evidence paints a grim picture of Neanderthal health. Skeletal remains show clear signs of chronic respiratory infections, with damaged ribs and spine deformities suggesting prolonged bouts of violent coughing. Some individuals display evidence of tuberculosis, a disease that would have been a slow, agonizing death sentence in their world. The infection would have eaten away at their lungs over months or years, leaving them gasping for breath as they struggled to keep up with their nomadic lifestyle. But respiratory diseases were just one of many health nightmares that plagued Neanderthal communities. Parasitic infections ran rampant through their populations. Roundworms, tapeworms, and other intestinal parasites weakened their already stressed bodies, stealing precious nutrients from their meagre diets. The constant presence of these parasites meant that even when food was abundant, Neanderthals often suffered from malnutrition and chronic fatigue. Archaeological analysis of Neanderthal coprolites, fossilized feces, reveals the horrifying extent of these parasitic infections. Some samples contain so many parasite eggs that researchers estimate the individuals were carrying massive worm loads that would have caused severe anemia, abdominal pain, and digestive problems. Imagine trying to hunt a woolly rhinoceros while your gut writhed with parasites, draining your strength with every step. The evidence suggests that some Neanderthal groups developed crude treatments for these ailments. Researchers have found traces of medicinal plants in Neanderthal dental calculus, the hardened plaque on their teeth. Yarrow and chamomile, both known for their anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving properties, were apparently consumed regularly by some individuals. This indicates a remarkable level of botanical knowledge and suggests that Neanderthals had developed their own primitive pharmacy. But even more intriguing is the discovery of birch bark tar in some Neanderthal sites. This substance, which requires sophisticated heating techniques to produce, has powerful antiseptic properties. The fact that Neanderthals went through the complex process of making this tar suggests they understood its medicinal value. They may have used it to treat wounds, infections, or even as a primitive form of chewing gum to maintain dental health. However, their attempts at medicine were often overwhelmed by the sheer brutality of their environment. Trauma was a constant companion in Neanderthal life. Skeletal remains show evidence of broken bones, dislocated joints, and severe head injuries with disturbing frequency. One famous Neanderthal skeleton known as Shanidar 1 shows evidence of multiple severe injuries: a withered arm, a blind eye, and a partially healed skull fracture. Yet this individual lived for years after these injuries, suggesting that his group cared for him despite his disabilities. This care for the injured and disabled is one of the most remarkable aspects of Neanderthal society. At the Cima de los Huesos site in Spain, researchers found the remains of a Neanderthal child who suffered from craniosynostosis, a condition where the skull bones fuse prematurely, causing severe developmental problems. This child lived for several years, which would have been impossible without dedicated care from the group. They fed him, protected him, and carried him as they moved across the landscape. Even. Though he could contribute nothing to their survival, such compassion came at a tremendous cost in a world where every calorie mattered and every moment of weakness could mean death. Yet Neanderthal groups repeatedly made this choice, supporting members who could no longer hunt or gather. At Chapelle in France, archaeologists discovered the remains of an elderly Neanderthal male who had lost most of his teeth and suffered from severe arthritis. He had been dead weight for years, unable to chew tough meat or participate in hunts. Yet his group kept him alive until he died of natural causes. This care extended beyond the living to elaborate burial rituals that suggest deep emotional bonds and possibly even belief in an afterlife. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, researchers found evidence that Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers. Analysis of pollen samples around the graves suggests the bodies were laid to rest on beds of colourful blooms. While some scientists debate whether this was intentional burial or natural pollen contamination, the careful positioning of the bodies and the presence of grave goods at other sites strongly suggest ritualistic behaviour. The mental health toll of their brutal existence cannot be understated. Modern studies of hunter-gatherer societies show high rates of depression and anxiety, even in relatively stable environments. For Neanderthals facing constant threats from predators, weather, and starvation, the psychological pressure must have been overwhelming. Some skeletal remains show evidence of stress-related conditions like cortical hyperostosis, abnormal bone growth that can result from chronic stress and malnutrition. Yet perhaps the most devastating health crisis facing Neanderthals was their own genetic vulnerability. Living in small isolated populations for thousands of years had created a severe genetic bottleneck. Inbreeding was common, and with it came a host of genetic disorders that weakened their ability to survive. Studies of Neanderthal DNA show reduced genetic diversity compared to modern humans, making them more susceptible to diseases and less adaptable to environmental changes. Their isolation also meant that when modern humans began migrating into Europe around 45,000 years ago, Neanderthals had no immunity to the diseases these newcomers carried. Like the devastating epidemics that would later sweep through Native American populations after European contact, novel pathogens brought by modern humans may have decimated Neanderthal communities long before direct competition for resources became a factor. The evidence for this disease-driven decline is circumstantial but compelling. Neanderthal populations began to crash around the same time that modern humans appeared in their territories. Archaeological sites show sudden abandonment, with tools and hearths left behind as if the inhabitants had simply vanished. While climate change and competition for resources certainly played roles in their extinction, the invisible killer of epidemic disease may have delivered the final blow. In their final millennia, as their populations dwindled and became increasingly isolated, Neanderthals faced a cruel irony. The very social bonds and care for the sick that made them remarkably human also made them vulnerable to disease transmission. Their close-knit family groups, their practice of caring for the elderly and disabled, their shared living spaces, all of these compassionate behaviours became vectors for death when epidemic diseases struck. The last Neanderthal populations, clinging to survival in caves across Spain and southern Europe, were likely shadows of their former selves. Weakened by inbreeding, ravaged by disease, and struggling with a changing climate, They watched their world contract until only scattered bands remained. Archaeological evidence from these final sites shows signs of desperate improvisation, crude tools hastily made from whatever materials were available, suggesting that traditional knowledge was being lost as communities collapsed. When the last Neanderthal died around 40,000 years ago, probably in a cave in southern Spain, they took with them not just their own lineage but the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of thousands of years of survival in Ice Age Europe. Their knowledge of medicinal plants, their understanding of seasonal patterns, their techniques for hunting massive prey. All of this vanished with them, leaving only scattered fossils and stone tools as testament to their struggle. Yet in a remarkable twist of fate, Neanderthals didn't disappear entirely. Modern genetic studies have revealed that most people of European and Asian descent carry small amounts of Neanderthal DNA, typically about 2 to 4% of their genome. This genetic legacy suggests that there was interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans during the thousands of years they coexisted. Ironically, some of these inherited Neanderthal genes appear to provide resistance to certain diseases, meaning that their genetic contributions may have helped our own species survive. The story of Neanderthal health and disease is ultimately a story about the double-edged nature of human compassion. Their care for the sick and disabled, their emotional bonds, their complex social structures, these traits that made them recognisably human, also made them vulnerable in ways that purely pragmatic survival strategies might not have been. They chose empathy over efficiency, community over ruthless individualism, and in doing so they created both their greatest strength and their ultimate weakness. As we look back across the vast gulf of time at these ancient relatives, we see in their struggles a reflection of our own ongoing battle against disease and death. Their primitive attempts at medicine, their care for the vulnerable, their refusal to abandon the weak. These behaviours echo through to our own modern healthcare systems and social safety nets. In their compassion, we recognise the seeds of our own humanity. The Neanderthals may have lost their fight for survival, but they left us something far more valuable than genetic material. They showed us that being human isn't just about intelligence or technology, or even survival skills. It's about choosing to care for each other, even when that care comes at great cost. In their bones, in their graves, in their final desperate attempts to heal and help and hold together as communities, we see the blueprint for what it truly means to be human. Their brutal world of disease and death ultimately taught them, and through them us, that survival isn't just about the fittest individuals, but about the strongest bonds between them. In facing the invisible enemy of disease with nothing but primitive medicine and fierce devotion to each other, Neanderthals wrote the first chapter in humanity's long struggle to defeat death itself. Though they lost that battle, their spirit of compassion and care lives on in every hospital, every act of kindness toward the sick, every choice we make to value human dignity over mere survival. The ghosts of their suffering echo through every modern pandemic, reminding us that disease has always been humanity's greatest enemy, and that our greatest weapon against it has always been our willingness to care for one another no matter the cost. Looking at the provided materials and building on the established script style, here's part 9 of the brutal life of Neanderthals. Yet even amid such overwhelming hardship and suffering, the Neanderthals displayed remarkable qualities that speak to their profound humanity. Archaeological evidence reveals a species capable of extraordinary compassion, one that cared for its most vulnerable members with a tenderness that defies our primitive stereotypes. At the Shanida cave in Iraq, researchers discovered the remains of a Neanderthal man who had lived for years despite being born with a withered arm, blindness in one eye, and significant physical disabilities. This individual, known as Shanida I, could never have survived alone in the brutal Neanderthal world. His very existence proves that his community chose to support him, to share their precious resources with someone who could contribute little to their survival. They fed him, protected him, and ensured he lived to old age in a time when even the strongest struggled to see their 40th year. This wasn't an isolated case of Neanderthal compassion. Throughout their territories, from Spain to Siberia, we find evidence of individuals who survived devastating injuries only through the care of their communities, broken bones that healed properly, suggesting careful nursing, toothless elderly individuals who lived for years after losing their ability to process tough foods, indicating that others pre-chewed their meals or provided soft foods. These weren't just random acts of kindness, but systematic patterns of care that reveal a species with deep emotional bonds and moral obligations to one another. The Neanderthals also developed sophisticated burial practices that speak to their spiritual and emotional depth. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, they carefully interred their dead in deliberately dug graves, positioning the bodies with intention and covering them with stones. Some burials show evidence of grave goods, tools and animal bones placed alongside the deceased, suggesting beliefs about an afterlife or at least a desire to honour the dead. The famous Canada IV burial appeared to contain flower pollen, leading some researchers to propose that Neanderthals may have adorned their dead with wildflowers, though this remains debated. Whether or not they used flowers, the careful treatment of their dead reveals a species grappling with mortality, loss, and the meaning of existence. Their capacity for symbolic thought extended beyond death rituals. Neanderthals created the world's first known cave art, painting abstract symbols.